it going?
Good. How are you?
Doing well. We are obviously so excited. Welcome back to Taking the Scare Out of the Square. I'm Lars Mellis.
I'm Rachel Lang.
We know it's been a minute.
It has been a minute for everybody.
Right. I think it's been an understandable pause.
Right.
Right. And since we shot, I would say it's like season 1, right?
Yeah,
season 1. We've had videos be seen thousands of times.
Yes.
And a lot of people really getting the fact that squares shouldn't be scary, right?
Yeah, no, they're actually some of our greatest strengths and some of our aspects of our character.
Absolutely. Right. And we refine them over time, right? And
right.
the best things take time.
They do. They're like diamonds.
They are, right? And tension is a useful condition to create a diamond. But what have you been up to since we spoke last?
Well, I wrote a book.
Oh my goodness, look at that. Please tell us about it.
This is Modern Day Magic, 8 Simple Rules to Realize Your Power and Shape Your Life. And it's a book all about, really it's about magic. It's about reclaiming your magic. It's about owning your power. And there's a whole section here on how to use astrological magic in your everyday life.
I'm so happy I have a copy because that's going to be so valuable for me. Where can the viewing audience find this?
Anywhere books are sold.
Love it.
What have you been up to?
Yes.
You've had
a bit. There's been a bit of development. So I got elected 2 days after my Saturn return to the National Board of NCGR, which is the largest international astrology association. And I think I'm the first millennial to be on the board.
Yes.
So it's been quite an experience and definitely feel like I'm coming into my Saturn return, right? Like Saturn is all about maturity and I'm taking it upon myself. You know, I have Saturn in the 11th, so go figure that I'm part of this big massive
an
board.
Organization, right. You've also been doing comedy.
I have been as well. I think some people might be a little confused by the channel because there's some other videos that are coming in that are more comedic. Feel free to just watch the astrological ones if you want. But yeah, I am launching a stand-up career that's been on and off for 10 years. Very much a Sagittarius, as you know. Sag, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Mars. So comedy is a very much part of my identity, I feel like. And with my Saturn return, I'm really sort of like taking it seriously now.
Good. He's so talented. So
thank you.
If you live in LA and you have a chance to see him live, I highly, highly recommend it because you won't stop laughing and your stomach will hurt the next day.
That means so much. And if you like astrology too, I will have a show on December 8th in Sherman Oaks at Liberate Yourself called What's Your Sign? It's part stand-up comedy, part astrology, all fun.
Great. Well, I'll be there for sure.
Thank you. Can't wait to see you there. Let's jump into this aspect.
Yes. We have Venus square Uranus.
It's our first Uranus square. All season 1, we were so focused on Saturn and Pluto, I think, that because I feel like those are really notable ones. They get vilified a lot, but people forget about Uranus.
Right.
And Uranus can be uncomfortable.
It can be uncomfortable, not just for the person who has that aspect, but also for their partner.
Also for the other person involved.
Yes, for the relationship.
Definitely. So let's break it apart, right?
Yep.
So what we do is we're gonna talk about Venus first, then we'll talk about Uranus, and then we'll talk about squares for a bit, and then we'll bring it all together with what Venus square Uranus means. How does that sound?
That sounds good.
Cool. So with Venus, of course, my main place that I go as a practitioner when I look at someone's Venus is very much tied to their values and their worthiness, their sense of worth. That's a huge thing when it comes to Venus, right?
Yeah. Venus relates to our relationships, so love and also money. And the connection between those two is that the more we value ourselves and the more we prioritize ourselves, the more successful we are in our lives, the more open we are to healthy, loving relationships. And so there's a real tie between those 3 themes with Venus.
When I watch this back, I'm gonna click back to listen to you say that again because it is so profound for Venus and how to work with your Venus regardless of what aspects you have with your natal Venus. Another thing that you did mention, tied to that would also be your sense of beauty, because your sense of beauty is, of course, your sense of worthiness as well, right? And with Venus square Uranus, we'll get into how Uranus really creates a uniquity around that, for sure.
Yeah, so Venus is your style. It's how you dress, and we both have Venus in Scorpio.
Yes, we do.
I can usually tell where someone's Venus is just by looking at the colors in their closet.
Right. No, 100%. This is the number one color in my closet,
yes,
for sure.
Me
Yeah.
too. And Venus is also, it's not necessarily our creative expression, that's more of the sun, but it is that creative urge, that creative impulse that we have. And the way that creativity expresses itself through art, through theater, through dance, those kinds of things. And I think that goes along with what you were saying about Venus being tied to beauty.
Right. Definitely. When it comes to Venus, I think those are the real major things. Of course, personal finance is another component to it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially from the modern lens, Venus is the ruler entirely. I do recognize that from a Hellenistic standpoint, Mercury would rule commerce, of course, but like when it comes to personal finances, it's Venus, right?
Yeah, it's just how you spend your money, like what kinds of things you like to buy, and also your relationship with money. So everything Venus related is relationship related. It's that impulse to how do we attract. So I like to think of when we're looking at law of attraction, or when you're looking at manifestation, Venus is what we draw into our lives, and how we draw it in. So think about like when you're flirting with someone, what is your flirting style? That's Venus. But we flirt with the things that we want in our lives too, like money, stuff, possessions, those kinds of things.
Absolutely. I mean, the nature of Venus is creating a union, right? Whereas Mars is severing. Yeah. Like, Venus is all about creating that union, right? Yeah. So, especially when you're looking at the Venusian aspects in your chart, how Venus is interacting with another planet it's definitely gonna color, or it's gonna create spice to that urge to make that union, right? Totally.
I love that.
So then, in speaking of which, the other dance partner here with Venus is Uranus. I call Uranus the KoolAid Man. That's trademarked. If anyone's watching, this is trademarked. So essentially, because Uranus is very much tied to breakups, breakdowns, breakthroughs, I think about the KoolAid Man, because with the commercial of the KoolAid Man, what does he do? He burst through that drywall, right? Yeah. But the overall purpose is to liberate you from your thirst. Right. He couldn't go through the door frame because it was a very solid, sturdy foundation. Yeah. But that drywall needed to be replaced 3 months ago. You know it. And so it needed to come down. And that's essentially what Uranus is in a nutshell, right?
I love it. That is, the KoolAid Man.
The KoolAid Man.
This is good. This is
right.
Really,
so we're dealing with Venus and the KoolAid Man. Venus squared KoolAid Man.
Yeah. I like to think of Uranus as, now I'm going to give another archetype.
I love it. So you have KoolAid Man.
Yes, KoolAid Man is one. But Uranus is also the mad scientist.
Okay.
The professor who's like in his or her lab. I almost called it studio. You can tell what world I live in. In their studio, like coming up with inventions, being very different than everybody else. It's Uranus is kind of a rebel planet. It's the planet that relates to our need for freedom, our need for independence, and our need for innovation, progress, and change.
Right. And I feel like Uranus gets the bad rep for the archetype I described, because what are you dealing with when the KoolAid Man does it? You're dealing with a destroyed house, right? But it was a faulty foundation. There's that liberation. There's that need for progress, right? Because the status quo, that drywall wasn't going to cut it in the long run, right? And so it's very important. I feel like this is an aspect that's going to get vilified because of either the instability that Uranus kind of imbues in Venus, or the erratic nature that it does, but also, like, we're going to talk about the progress that it imbues as well.
Yeah. And I think if we can understand that, like what you said about the KoolAid Man, that Uranus's primary goal is for our freedom, for us. And what we're talking about is not just a freedom to do whatever we want to do, but a freedom from those Saturn things of the limiting beliefs, the cultural conditioning. Like Uranus wants us to be ourselves in a radical way, in a way that we abandoned, or not abandoned, but that we step away from that cultural conditioning, and that we really own the truth of who we are and live that way.
Amen. No, totally, 100%. And as you know, both of us have been working very hard on a Saturn square Uranus.
Yes.
It's a symposium that's occurring on November 5th through 7th. Are tickets still available for that?
Tickets are still available, yeah.
So definitely the relationship between Saturn upholding the status quo and Uranus being this Miley Cyrus on a wrecking ball kind of for change, if you will, is going to be explored more there. But that's definitely something to look at. Like, Uranus is very much against societal conditioning, right? And all of us have deal with that to some extent, some more than others. And I think those Venus square Uranus people, or just the people who are Uranus dominant, are the little mini Miley Cyruses on wrecking balls, like that are really working towards that progress and that liberation.
They're change agents for
Change
sure.
agents. I think that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
So we have Venus in Uranus, right?
Both of those.
So we're dealing with a 90-degree square,
90
right?
90-degree square.
So when you think about clients who bring up squares to you maybe, or like people who are early on in their astrological journey, what are the words that come out of their mouths when they talk about squares?
Tension, stuck, because a square is that internal tension,
right?
That they're the lifelong patterns that we are moving through, but it's more of an internal sense of negotiating within ourselves, of contrasting wants and contrasting desires. What kind of words do you...
Yeah, I would say that I think of either like a blockage or an overcompensation of, because of that 90-degree angle. The other thing is more of a sensation. This is something you taught me, is if you create a 90-degree angle with your hands, you can feel the tension that's just kind of already present, right? Yeah. And so typically the square is vilified. Ptolemy called the quartile, which is the old school way of a square, as being of inimicable, like an enmity, is what he said, which is like a pretty abrasive terminology, right? Just because the two sides don't share, that one is going to be masculine, one's going to be feminine, probably, they don't see each other at all, and so push needs to come to shove.
Right. Within every 90-degree angle is structure. And so often people who have significant squares in their charts really feel this drive to improve, for self-improvement, and that usually results in being a hard worker, in being very dedicated, being very committed, being willing in relationships or in career or in other areas of their lives to stay until they get it right, until they figure it out. Even if we're talking about Uranus, which we're going to in just a second.
Totally. And then one thing from the more traditional standpoint is that the square was considered to be the aspect that had the nature of Mars.
Yes.
And so when we think about Mars, a very channeled Mars can have drive, can have ambition, can be assertive, can really get stuff done and be courageous, right? But an unchecked Mars, just like an unchecked square, can be wily and destructive and self-destructive. It's almost like you light yourself on fire, right? So at the end of the day, I think it's our responsibility to take responsibility for our squares, because there's so much power and potential that lie in them.
Yeah, and when we do, and we take the scare out of them and look at the positives of them, then we can see that our greatest strength, our greatest assets lie in not just the square itself, but the way that we work with it, the way that we mediate it, the way that we move through it throughout our lives.
I love that. That's so great. So without further ado, let's jump into it. So we have Venus square Uranus. So I understand that you know someone who has a Venus square Uranus.
I do. My wife has it.
There you go. Okay, so very close to this aspect. And what are some of what's the big bullet point or two bullet points that you would like to highlight for everyone with it?
Yeah. So with anyone who has this aspect, there's within relationships, because this plays out in relationships a lot, there's a constant need for growth, for evolution. You don't want to be part of the status quo. And sometimes this can also mean that when the relationship is stagnant or when it's not growing, then that person can feel very restless within the relationship and have a strong desire to change things up.
There shouldn't be that fear around change, right? I think one thing about a Venus square Uranus that's really strong is that change is not only inevitable, but it's required, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes, I mean, I feel like for a relationship to really evolve and to really see every side of each other and to really grow with each other, there needs to be some major changes sometimes.
Absolutely.
Sometimes you got a KoolAid Man yourself in that relationship,
you do,
right?
Yeah, and I think this brings up another point too, is that we have this cultural idea, this cultural notion that monogamy is the way to go, and that a relationship's value and worth are based on its longevity, or that relationships have to look a certain way, or that we have to be in relationships to be whole people. And for someone with Venus square Uranus, this is not always the case. Sometimes freedom, independence, going from one relationship taking some time away, going into another relationship. I think anyone who has this square needs to give themselves permission to be flexible, to, you know, let go of some of that cultural conditioning.
I love that. I think that's a big recommendation if you at home are struggling with a Venus square Uranus, is to be okay either not being in a relationship or, you know, be okay with the fact that you won't settle for a partner that just wants to stay the same and just wants to plateau. The white picket fence may not work for Venus square Uranus, and that's okay. It's 2021,
yeah,
right?
Exactly. So have a villa in Italy.
Oh, love it. Okay, yeah.
Have a, you know, a beach house in Aspen.
Yeah, something in Aspen on the mountains. But have that change, right? I think, you know, Uranus gets the rep for restlessness, right? For sure. It's very much associated with frenetic energy, right? And so, especially early on, pre-Saturn return, there might be that restlessness in regards to like not fitting into the normal way of coupling, right?
Yeah.
Be open to exploring and like having those tough conversations with yourself about what might work for you. You know, it may not be the traditional monogamous relationship. Maybe it's polyamory, or maybe it's a capstone relationship or some sort of unique form, right? But definitely exploration could do this aspect a lot of good.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that also applies to money, to finances. You know, depending on other factors in your chart, there could be times when money ebbs and flows. Like for people who do freelance work, for example, or like I find that people with this aspect, that staying committed to like one job and one path and one way of making money throughout your whole life, that feels really limiting. So recognize that there are ups and downs in terms of your finances. There could be windfalls followed by times where you're not making as much, and be prepared for those times, for the ups and downs.
That's a really good point, and I think it also speaks to the fact that when we deal with Uranus, we're dealing with like the planet that's very much against the system and systems at play. So sometimes for this aspect, when it comes to money, being your own boss too is a big deal. You mentioned freelance, which like is very much tied to that. Like if you are finding that the 9 to 5 is not the way to go, figuring out a way to be your own boss for this aspect could be one big relief and one way to maybe channel it for good.
Yeah, for sure.
Let's see, I would say outside of that, you can typically pick a Venus square Uranus person out of a crowd. A crowded baseball field, you can pick out the Venus square Uranus people. There's such a unique sense of style and a creativity that this aspect can definitely bring.
Yeah, and they might be the ones who are introducing people to new music, or just like being the first of their friends to discover the latest band, or, you know, there's a real curiosity about being exposed to different art, music, theater, and different creative processes. Even if they don't have a way of expressing that themselves, they tend to be forward thinking, because Uranus is also the future. So this is another thing too, is that sometimes they can be like way out in the future in terms of, I know that this person and I belong together. I know that we're going to be together, but the other person has to catch up. So there's a lot of like kind of forward thinking, futuristic ways of being in relationships and being in work that I find with this aspect.
That's huge. You know, I one other thing that comes to mind for me is very much the idea that with Venus representing the planet of value, right? Typically what a Venus square Uranus values can sometimes be either left of center or misunderstood, right? They can be vilified for their sense of values, but they could just be ahead of the curve, right? Or they could just be against what society tells us we should and shouldn't value.
Yeah, so true, so true. And so I think for anyone who has this in your chart, just knowing that, know that you popularity, for example, setter, and not necessarily to follow along with what everybody else is doing. And so if you struggle with popularity, for example, or if you feel like you're out, you know, you're different than other people, this is something that, you know, my wife explained, you know, in high school, feeling different and being the cool dresser, actually. So, you know, and she knew the good music, she knew the good clothes. But this is something that I think, don't let that be a scar that you carry into adulthood, because you are a leader in many ways.
Right. I love that. And people can follow you.
Yeah,
I love
exactly. They will.
I think that's a great place to end it, right?
Yes.
So hope this helped. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Mm-hmm.
Don't forget you can get Rachel's book anywhere books are sold. And in the description below, there'll be a link to tickets for the Saturn Square Uranus Symposium. Love it. Can't wait for that.
Me neither. And Lars is going to be speaking at that.
I'm going to be speaking there too. Yeah, I'll be
Yeah.
speaking on taking the scare out of the square. So if you want more of it, that's where you can find it.
Great.
See you next time.
Bye.
Yay.